why do you need a conveyancer, and what do they actually do? Today, to help me with this topic, we have the wonderful Karina Merritt here, who is a conveyancer. She runs a conveyancing business called Merritt Conveyancing. Today we are specialising on conveyancing in South Australia, but we will touch on the other jurisdictions throughout the segment. Welcome, Karina. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Marissa.
So as I said, today we're going to talk about what is a conveyancer, why do we need one, what do they do, all of those things. We are taking questions and comments live today as well, so if you do have anything you wanted to ask Karina, she's here, she's open to answer your questions today, and we'd love to hear from you. So please feel free to put your comments below and give us a shout out as we go through this live today. So Karina, you're a conveyancer. You've been a conveyancer for over 10 years, I believe. Is that right?
Yes.
Conveyancer in South Australia?
Yep.
Yeah. So let's just start by the basics. What is a conveyancer and what do they do?
Okay, that's a great question. It's actually a frequently asked question that we get from people. Most people don't know what a conveyancer is until they actually need one.
Yes. And the thing is, people do need them at multiple stages in their life, because every time you buy a property, you need a conveyancer. Yes. And often people don't realise that, do they?
No, they don't. Yeah. So what we do as conveyancers is we are involved in the settlement process, and we organise the legal transfer of ownership from one person to another person or entity.
So it's a very important part of the sales process, because when you are buying a new property, of course you need to organise your finance, which we can help with. You need to, there's a lot to think about when you're buying a new property, but the legal transfer of ownership, I would say, is up there with the most important thing about that transaction, really,
yes,
isn't it?
Absolutely.
You want to make sure that at the end of the day, what you've paid for is actually what you've got.
Correct. And we want to make sure that that title that you're receiving is a clear title.
Yeah. So could you say that conveyancers really protect the legal interests of the buyer or the seller or your client?
Absolutely. Yeah. That's our number one thing that we need to do for people.
So for people out there that are asking themselves this question, could you actually proceed with the purchase without the help of the conveyancer? What would you say?
No longer. You do need a conveyancer to act for you. There have been some changes over the last few years in South Australia, which makes it difficult for people to undertake their own conveyancing. Look, with the sort of importance of the conveyancing process, it's important to have a professional acting for you to make sure that it's done correctly.
Yeah, I second that. I agree with that. We help people every day buy new homes, buy new investment properties, and the assistance of a conveyancer is, not negotiable. It's an absolute must. Yes. And it makes the process go smoothly, and then there's confidence from the purchaser or the buyer or whoever you're acting for that it's going through as it should. Mm-hmm. So outside of helping with the settlement and the legal aspects of it, what are the other parts in the process that you can help your clients with as a conveyancer? Like, for example, do you help them review their purchase contract, or can you help them understand conditions in the contract? Like, what can you assist your clients with outside of just the legal transfer of ownership? Yeah,
okay. So definitely with buyers or purchasers of property, it's important to get a conveyancer involved as early as possible. Mm-hmm. Some people who might be their first time buying a home, they could have questions before they've even found a property that they want to buy. Yeah. So they can come to a conveyancer and ask those questions. But definitely once they have secured a property, we're there to review their legal documents to make them comfortable for signing.
And so what are the sort of questions that you get before someone finds a property to purchase? What are some of the common questions?
They might be wondering about what they need to put on their offer form.
Yes.
Just the different terms, whether it is how long they should put on there for the settlement process, what kind of deposit that they need to pay, things like that.
Yeah, okay, great. And once they've sort of signed the contract and that's been accepted, do you often help them to review that contract in the cooling off period? And what sort of things do you look for when you're reviewing those contracts?
Yeah, definitely. It's important to make sure everything is correct during that calling off period. Give them advice on what should be done during that calling off period, including building and pest inspections,
Yep.
Making sure that their finance is on track, and also just making sure that all the terms and conditions in that contract are as they would want them to be before that
Yes.
calling off period finishes.
That's really important because, you know, often it can be, especially if it's a first time buyer or, you know, people don't buy a house very frequently in their life. It's not something that they're doing every day.
Yeah.
So sometimes the purchase contract can seem a bit overwhelming. So having someone like you in their corner,
Yeah.
where, you know, it's still important that a purchaser reviews their contract themselves, but
Yes.
having someone with experience who knows what to look for and
Yeah.
is able to interpret it into
Yeah.
simple English, I think
Yeah.
is really important.
Yeah, it is a big transaction for them. Yeah.
So you said that it's good for purchasers to engage a conveyancer as early as possible. What do you actually recommend as the ideal stage for a purchaser to engage the services of a conveyancer in South Australia?
Ideally, as soon as they've been successful in securing a property.
Okay.
Ideally once those documents have been presented to them so that we can help to review them.
Yep. And what about for sellers? Because sellers also need a conveyancer as well, not just buyers. So if a seller is selling their property, at what point should they engage a conveyancer in an ideal world?
Yeah, so with selling, most people sell through a real estate agent. These days, the real estate agents engage the conveyancer to prepare the Form 1 document.
Yep.
So it's at that point that the conveyancer becomes involved.
Okay.
So we prepare that for the sellers. Once the property is sold, then we continue with the settlement process.
Yep, excellent. So how long does the conveyancing process take?
Okay, so
Is this how long is a piece of string?
a little bit. So, look, most agents prefer a 30-day settlement period,
Yes.
But this isn't always possible. There's other factors that can contribute to the settlement process and how long it takes. People might be buying and selling a property at the same time, so they might need more time to sell their property.
Yes.
Other factors which need to be considered with the finance of someone who's buying, they could have a more complex finance situation where they require a guarantor or a refinance,
Yes.
which could take more time than your standard 30 days.
Yeah. So I guess that, would you say that, you know, we always encourage when someone is buying a house to, you know, we try and talk to them in advance about their settlement period based on the complexity of what we have to embark on. It's great to see that you're also having that conversation with them as well up front. So I definitely suggest that if you are looking to buy, that you are getting advice from your mortgage broker, from your conveyancer as to what would be the ideal terms and conditions to place on the contract. It's also really interesting to note that you know, there are certain terms of the contract that are negotiable. Like you just mentioned one of them, which is the settlement date.
Yes.
So the agent and the vendor might want a standard settlement date of 30 days, but it is negotiable.
Correct.
Another one that I see is quite common is the amount of deposit required.
Yes.
So, you know, often the standard is about 10% of the
That's
purchase
right.
price.
But that can vary. So,
Yeah.
look, some people don't have a 10% deposit. So
Yes.
they might be refinancing another property to pull out money towards the purchase. They might be receiving money from family as a gift or something like that. So definitely these terms of the contract are negotiable.
Yes, that's
at,
right.
at the time of purchasing.
Yes, so a lot of purchasers don't realise they can negotiate that. When it comes to purchasing at auction, it's a bit different, obviously, because you don't have your cooling off period, so you're not going to have the benefit of getting your contracts checked in that cooling off period. What advice do you have for people that are purchasing at auction? What do they need to do to prepare for that auction date in terms of pre-negotiating their conditions or whatever else they need to prepare? And then when should they get you involved at that point?
Yeah, so yes, auction does run a little bit differently.
Yes.
On the fall of that hammer, it's unconditional, so we need to have all our ducks in a row beforehand. So the things that I speak to people about before an auction, we do review the Form 1. The Form 1 needs to be available 3 days prior to an auction from the real estate agent. That's really important to look through. That's the disclosure to that purchaser. obviously they need to make sure that their finance is in order. So
Yes.
a pre-approval
Yes.
is definitely something that is,
Required.
and preferred, yeah.
Yes.
So, and also if they are very interested in the property, to perhaps to undertake a building and pest inspection prior to the auction.
Yes.
I had someone come to me the other day and ask, before going to auction, about the settlement period and how long they could ask for before an auction. They do fill in a registration form.
Yes.
And because of their circumstances, they wanted a longer settlement period. So I just said to them to ensure that the agent's aware that they do need, have these requirements before
Yes.
going into the auction and bidding.
And how often do the agents sort of reject a bidder on that basis? Like, is it possible that the agents can reject a bidder on that basis?
I suppose the agent would need to speak to the vendor about it, and everyone's circumstances are different. So
Yes.
the vendor would have their own requirements of what they need at that auction, and the agent would need to let the purchaser know prior to bidding.
Yes. And often the deposit can be a contentious issue, especially if the property is a higher value. It's a lot of money to set aside for that period of time. Can you explain to our viewers what actually happens to that deposit from the time that it's paid to the time that settlement happens? Because I think there's a misconception of where that money's actually sitting and what's happening to it. I think that would be a really good thing to share with our community.
Yeah, okay. So, whether buying at auction or buying off the market, after the calling off period, if buying off the market, the deposit is paid to the real estate agent and it's held in a trust account. So, trust account is a holding account.
Yes.
For this deposit. The deposit sits there until the settlement is achieved. That deposit is security, I guess, for the seller or the vendor, that their property is under contract.
Yeah.
There are times where the contract may fall through and the deposit can be returned to the purchaser. However, there are times where somebody might be in breach of that contract, and the deposit's then forfeited to the vendor.
So basically the vendor doesn't actually see that money until settlement date.
That's correct.
So negotiating a different deposit amount doesn't actually impact the vendor, except for the fact that they probably have a little bit less security,
That's right.
Being held in that trust fund. So I think that's really interesting to point out.
Correct, yeah. The deposit
Yeah.
makes up part of the purchase price.
Yeah. And what are the costs of engaging a conveyancer in South Australia?
Okay, so there's no scale in South Australia whereby we need to sit at or charge for conveyancing, so it does vary. From my experience in South Australia, you can pay anywhere between $600 to $700 up to $1,500 to $2,000 for conveyancing,
Yes.
depending on the complexity of the transaction. My suggestion is always to get a quote up front for your conveyancing fees before starting the process.
Is it normally like a fixed price? Like, can you normally sort of quote it up front and then have a fixed price, or is it, more of a per hour type arrangement?
No, so from my knowledge, most conveyancers don't charge per hour. There are fixed fees. However, with the lots of sort of different transactions, there could be a lot of fees that are added on top of each other. So when getting a quote, it's sort of good idea to sort of compare apples to apples.
Yeah, excellent. And in what instances are conveyancer fees tax deductible?
Yes, so I believe that conveyancing fees are tax deductible with investment properties.
Yes.
However, we'd sort of always direct you to speak to your accountant about any taxation issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's just quickly touch on, because obviously we're focusing mainly on South Australian conveyancing today, but in every other state, if you purchase a property in other states, then you do need a conveyancer that specialises in that particular state where the property is located.
Yes.
We were chatting before the episode and you were saying how that you do have actually clients all over Australia,
Yes.
but they're buying property in South Australia.
Yes.
So what are some of the things that are a little bit different, in other states that might be, that people need to be aware of? And just so that people understand that they do need to find the conveyancer in the state that the property that they're buying is going to be in?
Yeah, so each state runs its own titles office, and they are run differently.
Yes.
We are each qualified in our own state,
Yes.
so that we can practice and make sure that the legal documents are prepared correctly for the state that we practice in.
Yeah.
And obviously fees and charges would vary from state to state.
Yeah.
I think it's always important when looking for somebody to transact on your property, depending on which state you're looking at, to perhaps locate the industry body, which is the AIC, the Australian Institute of Conveyancers, if you're looking for a referral in that state.
Wonderful, that's great advice. And how does conveyancing differ based on the type of property? So obviously there's, residential property, which is houses, but there's also commercial property, industrial property. Do most South Australian conveyancers cover all of those types of property, or do conveyancers specialise in specific types of property? And is there much of a difference in terms of the conveyancing work across those types of properties?
Look, there are a lot of different types of aspects with conveyancing. You've mentioned a few there. So there's residential conveyancing, commercial conveyancing. We also undertake land divisions.
Okay.
There are transfers.
Like subdivisions?
Correct.
Yeah. Okay,
yes.
great.
Transfers between related parties. Transfers as a result of separation or a deceased estate. Look, it's really important for a conveyancer to look at each individual transaction. Every transaction has its own set of circumstances.
Yes.
So as much as there are, things that roll over the transactions from one to the other, we need to treat each one individually.
Another common thing that we see people need help from conveyancer is when they need to change their name on the title. That might be, maybe their name has changed because of marriage, or, we've even had people from overseas that, have had name variations on their identification based on change of name. So that's another area. So it's interesting to see all the uses of a conveyancer outside of just buying and selling, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So anytime anything needs to be changed on a title, you will need a conveyancer to assist you with that process.
Yeah. That's been really helpful today, Karina. Thank you so much for sharing your wealth of knowledge.
Thanks for having me.
We really enjoy working with you, and love how easy you make it for your clients to go through the process and understand everything. I guess I want to leave the audience with one final question, and then we'll wrap it up because we are running out of time. If someone is looking for a conveyancer, what are the things that are important to look for in making sure that they're finding the right conveyancer for them?
Yeah, look, other than obviously obtaining quotes from conveyancers to see how much you're going to be paying for the process, it's important to speak to the conveyancer and make sure that you feel comfortable with them.
Yes.
And see if they can answer those questions that you've got about this transaction that you're about to enter into. They're there to guide you and help you in this process, something which is quite important at that time.
I think that's such an important point because, I see a lot of people that just engage a conveyancer and then don't really utilise that conveyancer because they don't really know how to benefit or get value out of that service, or don't really know what questions to ask, or feeling a bit shy of asking questions. But if you can secure a conveyancer that you feel really comfortable with and that you're not afraid to ask the silly questions, where no question is silly, but it might feel silly to you in that moment, you feel really comfortable with them, then I think it's great. That wraps up our session today. I just want to do a shout out to Corey, Adri, Sid, Amanda, Andrew, Jess, Richard. Thanks so much for joining in, guys. If you do have any questions for us or comments, we would love to hear from you following this segment. And thanks again, Karina, for joining us. And we hope that you've found value out of today's session. We'll see you again next time.
Thank
Bye.
you.